Okay, thank you. I come today to talk about the impact that war and displacement is having on children. And I'm not a psychologist, but I have been fairly closely involved with children in Iraq and also studying child development generally. So the first few slides I'm going through really quickly because I just want to put it in a global perspective. So we really begin to understand what's happening globally at the moment. So according to UNICEF, 1 in 10 children now live in conflict-affected areas. So that's an estimated 245 million children around the world. Worldwide, nearly 28 million children have been forcibly displaced. 10 million child refugees, approximately 1 million asylum-seeking children, and an estimated 17 million children displaced within their own countries by violence and conflict. In Iraq, we have around between 1.5 and 2 million children internally displaced. And this were the new displacements for last year, almost 1 million from the Congo, 874 million from Syria, and 659,000 from Iraq. I think this year we'll probably see a lot more coming out of Iraq. So first of all, I just want to allow us to think what a child needs for its healthy emotional and cognitive development. And the very basic thing for all children is secure attachment, is that real bond between the early mother and caregivers, which actually it's a foundation for everything else that happens in life. And the quality of that also depends on the psychological state of that mother or grandmother or father or whoever it is the primary caregiver. And what we're seeing in these conflict areas, in Iraq in particular, is that parents are already so stressed. And this is affecting children even before they're born. If you have a mother in a war situation who feels there's just danger all around her, she's highly stressed, she doesn't know how to feed her children, this is already going to affect the child even before it's born. And we find that children are born already sort of hyperreactive. It's very hard to soothe them by normal methods. And so it is these kind of primary attachments, and it's not just to the parents, but for a child to be really healthy and develop well, it's the entire community. Is that sense of belonging that we have to, our close family, our extended family, our friends, our natural environment, our home, everything that makes us and our nervous systems feel secure from the very beginning. And what they're discovering, as we've gone right round in a circle, but our most advanced scientists now tell us that children in early traditional societies, they have enhanced social skills, emotional skills, intelligence far more than in our more modern lifestyles. And as the former speaker was saying, in Iraq, there were these very strong communities before everything became shattered and broken. Talking about children in particular, children are actually less resilient than adults. Often we're told otherwise, but they are less resilient. This is because they lack the wider understanding or context very often, especially young children, of what's happening. When we think about being traumatized, so you think you're going to lose your life, or it's that survival thing. Like a young child, simply a young child being separated from the mother will experience that separation as a life-death event. They are extremely vulnerable. And also because the rapid brain development, especially in those early years, if you think of all those neural connections being made. There's thousands every second, and in very young children, it's how we learn to walk and talk, and sort of evolve so much in those first years. But it's that same process that is taking in stress and trauma. And so from an early age, a child in a very stressful, traumatized environment will be laying down in its brain architecture that the world is not a safe place, that it's not okay. And this may emerge even if things improve and they have an otherwise happy childhood. These things will emerge later in life through addictions, through depression, anxiety, and many times forms of illness. So, this is why those first few years of life are so important. As I say, children automatically react to adult stress, to those around them. So parents who are very stressed, this will automatically be have quite a profound effect on the children. The young children are very at risk, but so are adolescents actually, because again there's a slight sort of imbalance in the emotional brain and the frontal cortex at that age. And as we know, adolescents see everything emotionally. And so that can lead to a lot of depression, of suicide, anxiety states, and also high risk taking. That's why so many young men join militias and often do really crazy things. And the suicide rates are definitely going up in these areas of war. Even children as young as 12 now are committing suicide. Oh, sorry. If we just look at what's happening in these wars, we're seeing the most horrendous things that children are having to experience, and a whole combination. We see this the violence of a lot of aerial bombardment, of heavy shelling in residential areas, the targeting of civilians by all sides. So the civilians seem at the moment to be that, there's so many different actors in these wars, from international to national to militias, and civilians just caught up in this whole mix. And with children, especially those who are separated, they're really in danger of abduction and trafficking and forced recruitment, so they are very vulnerable. Detention and torture. Currently there's around 2,000 Iraqi children in Iraqi jails at the moment, and they've been accused of close association with the Islamic State, but actually these children are the ones that are going to need the most care, the most psychological intervention, because anything to do with the Islamic State is extremely brainwashing and traumatizing. They've been through horrific things, and it's going to take a lot of care and input to get them out of that state of mind. But instead, they're being put in jail where they're often further abused, tortured. Starvation through sieges and blockades. Ever since the extraordinary blockade of Iraq in the 1990s, this has now become a pattern of war, of cities being surrounded, countries like Yemen again, being surrounded with extreme results, with famine, with Mosul, Fallujah, many places in Iraq in the last few years. Children have been, they've had to resort to eat grass and have died of famine. So, and this is also very stressful. There's stories coming out of Syria where children saying they would rather die. They aren't afraid of their bombs. If they die, they go to heaven and they get to eat. When you're starving, to eat is the only thing that you really want to do. They would rather be shot by a sniper and be wounded. Then maybe they get to hospital and they get to eat. So eating becomes an extraordinary priority for them. And then, of course, the targeting of hospitals, which is completely against international law, has now become a norm by all parties. The targeting of schools, educational establishments. For children, there's millions of children now who aren't able to go to school. And this is one of the, especially for older children, it's one of the most sort of sources of trauma and stress for them, because schools represent hope for the future, that they have a life, they have something to look forward to. And when they miss out years and years of education, they just feel completely abandoned and completely left out. There's many children now also having to leave school in order to do child labour because families are so poor. There's many girls being put into early marriages. And then there's the enforced statelessness of children. This is happening very much in Iraq, where children born within the areas that have been controlled by the Islamic State are now stateless. They haven't been given papers by their own sort of governments. So, and which means they aren't entitled. They aren't entitled to health. They aren't entitled to education. There's so many things they are not entitled to. It's like they don't exist. And I'm going to add to this is climate stress, because a lot of these people who are displaced, they're being displaced in areas which are really suffering from what we now know is climate change, with extreme heat in the summers and very cold in the winters. And, you know, we just had to imagine how a family in a tent in sort of 40, 50 degrees centigrade, you know, with a young baby, with not enough to drink, it's sort of, yeah, it's beyond horror. So if we look at how children are, in fact, reacting in the camps and other places, you know, parents are seeing their children kind of change. You know, little children who are always good and obedient and loving and kind and are suddenly becoming like really aggressive, hitting their siblings, refusing to do anything they're told. There's other children who become very quiet, withdrawn, just sit in the tent and won't go out. One of the worst things is the nightmares and the night horrors. No one gets any sleep because children just wake up in the night, you know, shouting and screaming because of what they're really experiencing. A lot of children say they feel sad all the time. They've lost close family members, they've lost friends, they've lost their home, they've lost their pets, they've lost everything that made life okay for them. So there's a lot of grief. Children, especially young children, complain, a lot of physical complaints. They will say they've got headaches, they've got stomach pains, they've got chest pains. Children are also regressing. There's a kind of developmental regression here where they will suddenly start to wet the bed again, to be incontinent, you know, even in the day. They're sucking their thumb, they're very clingy, they can't be left on their own. And if you imagine parents are already so stressed themselves, it must be so horrendous, you know, to have to deal with all these issues around your children. Speech disorders, we're seeing a lot of children starting to stutter. Some of them become completely mute. Those who have had very severe trauma will just absolutely stop speaking for a long period. And screaming. There's children who things are so terrible they can't express it in words anymore, so they just scream and they scream. Partial amnesia also with children just forgetting, you know, they get extremely confused, forget where they are, forget what's going on. Unable to distinguish past from present. This is part of the trauma. It's children, even when they've left the very dangerous situation, whether it's been caught up with the Islamic State or with the bombing, even if they're in a safe camp, they don't understand that they're safe. You know, they still think they're back where the horror is. They still think the bombs are going to come, or Daesh are going to come after them, or it's this confusion that just follows them around all the time. Lack of concentration and learning disabilities. When we're stressed, we all know this, when we're stressed and we're traumatized, the frontal cortex shuts down, the bit of the brain that we need to think. And so children that are highly stressed, even if they have the opportunity to go to school, which very few do, they can't learn, they can't concentrate. And that part of the brain just isn't working. And even things that they knew, they may have known how to add and subtract and know their letters, they're actually forgetting all that again. And I say with older children, it leads to quite a lot of risk-taking, depression and suicide. This is a quote from Dr. Marcia Brody. She's from Save the Children. Save the Children have done 2 very good studies, one on children on Mosul recently and one of children in Syria. But what she's saying about the children in Mosul, she says, what was striking was how introverted and withdrawn children had become. They rarely even smiled. It was as though they'd lost the ability to be children. When we asked them what they liked about themselves, children often said things like, I'm quiet, I stay in a safe place, or I obey orders. Their time under ISIS and making a life or death escape has truly taken a terrible toll. These children are not going to heal in weeks or even months. They'll need support for years to come. We have talked a little bit about toxic stress, so I'm not really going to go into this anymore, but some of the main risks are children who've been separated, who've had, obviously experienced something very traumatic, and this ongoing, that the toxic stress is really very common now because these stress situations are ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. So the brain actually resets itself in this particular way to be constantly responding to stress, even when it's safe. It's still looking out for something dangerous in the environment. And of course, it's also affected by previous trauma, neglect, people or children who've had things in their past that have been traumatized. If they're traumatized again, this will come up even more. Right. Resilience. Right. We're going to look on how to make it better. Children are resilient, and it's not just. But what this depends on is not the individual child. People used to think that a person or a child was just born resilient or not resilient, but we now really understand that this isn't true. So I've put some quotes, one from Anne Marston, who's a professor of child development in America, and she says, I like to say that the resilience of a child is distributed. It's not just in the child, it's just distributed in their relationships with the many other people who make up that world. And Dr. Bruce Perry, who says, resilient children are made, not born. And I put this picture here. It's actually a Syrian mother with a little boy. But this is the buffer, the main buffer for trauma is this strong attachment, usually with a mother figure. And then beyond that, anyone, in the environment who can make a relationship. It's all about relationship, how we relate. Children who have strong relationships with other adults, it does allow them to be far more resilient. So this is what really should be happening in these areas. And in some of the camps it is. I mean, the NGOs working do really understand a lot of this. It's just, again, getting the funding and the finance to put things in place that will really help children. And we have to remember in Iraq also that the majority of children are not in camps. They're displaced all over the place in abandoned buildings, often very isolated, and they're not getting the humanitarian help and input that they should be. So, to make things better, we have to support the families. We can't treat a child in isolation. To treat, we have to make all the family better. And in many cases, this is also to do with how they can support themselves economically and just to make them feel actually better about themselves. It's obviously meeting nutritional and basic needs, which is still not being done yet in many, many areas of Iraq. Participation and perceived control. Children, especially older children, if they feel they can be useful, if there's things that they can do, it gives them that self-esteem. Effective education, and here, schooling is really important, but it's even more important that it's effective. And for many refugees, they're in classes that are completely overcrowded, 80 to 120 in a class, and often the people teaching them are also stressed, and it's what children who, especially children with this kind of toxic stress, they need a lot of very high adult-child relationship with people who are calm, and this is not what they're getting.
So you have 1 minute?
Oh, sorry, yeah, okay. And opportunities for play and for safe spaces, and rhythm and routine is really, really important. So anything normal that can come back in their lives, and dancing and singing and playing and all those things is very important. Okay, half a minute. What needs to be done? The UN it has a whole branch to do with protecting children in war, and to be honest, it has very good intent, amazing people, but it's failing because we cannot protect children in war. So what needs to be done? One immediate thing is we need to extend the humanitarian funding, which is less than half funded for Iraq at the moment, despite that everything is happening. We have to remember that war is culture, it's not nature. And that for most of human existence, we have lived without war. And part of our brainwashing at the moment, is told that war is normal and natural. It is not normal and natural. We have to be taught and forced to do it. And to have, I think the best thing we can do for all these children is to hold that vision. And I know it feels hopeless sometimes when we look at the power structures in the world, but actually we have to have, if we're to survive as a species, and it's, this is really where we are at the moment in this time, if we're to survive, we have to have a vision of something different. And we can do this, and it's holding this vision of a world which does not have war, and it is possible. And I think this is the thing that we can all start to really work on, especially in the UK, which happens to be the only country in the world to be in permanently at war for over 100 years. So we have a lot of work to do in this country.